In the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels make a series of revolutionary claims about the structure and very basis of society. The ideas presented in that book are listed and discussed in the following discussion. The first and most primary idea discussed in the Communist Manifesto is this, that society is fundamentally split between two classes that are constantly in conflict: the bourgeoisie, the owners of production, and the proletariat, the workers. According to the authors, the bourgeoisie have created a market-based society that works for their own benefit and is constantly changing and evolving. The manifesto reads, constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. On the other side, the proletariat are victims of constant bourgeois exploitation and are forced into wage slavery. A proletarian is an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. As for the middle class, Marx and Engels dismiss them, stating that they will sink into the proletariat, partly because their diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale which modern industry is carried on, partly because their special skill is rendered worthless by new means of production. Generally, it's clear to me that Marx and Engels are correct on this point. First, the gap between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat has become more obvious than ever, with the top 10% of Americans owning more than 77% of the nation's wealth as of 2016. Those who would consider the working class, the bottom 50%, own less than 1% of the nation's wealth. Yet those at the bottom of the economic scale are producing most of the products necessary for the economy to function. There can be no other explanation for this than the exploitation of labor by self-serving bourgeoisie, and for that reason I stand with Marx and Engels on this point. I also concur with the author's view of the middle class, which is one that is not frequently held today. Skilled laborers like doctors, nurses, lawyers, plumbers, and others are inherently proletarian. At the end of the day, they receive a wage just like anyone else, and though their jobs are much harder to achieve than that of a factory worker, for example, their labor is still being used for the benefit of a bourgeoisie class who runs the company they work for. However, most of those in the middle class treat their working class counterparts with disdain. If more people were to recognize this lack of distinction between the two, a greater sense of class unity could be achieved. A second claim made in the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels is that the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. As the authors claim, since the bourgeoisie are the dominant economic force in a nation, they create a government that works in their own favor. We can find evidence of this, too, in modern society. First, the American government was founded largely by wealthy landowners who naturally structured the government's laws in their own interests. Before the election of Donald Trump, the president with the largest net worth in today's dollars was George Washington. Second, modern policy has clearly indicated that the government serves the rich. In 2017, President Trump passed a major tax cut that saw more than 60% of tax savings going to the top earning 20% of Americans and slashed corporate taxes by 40% with little impact on the wages of the lower classes. At the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, Congress passed a law that fed millions of dollars into corporate interests while doling out a measly $1,200 to the working class American. As such, the top billionaires in the country gained $434 billion while millions of Americans experienced economic fallout. Finally, in recent days, Congress has unveiled a bill that would protect bourgeoisie corporations from workers' lawsuits over improper coronavirus precautions in the workplace. Through this bill, Congress is giving owners of production a free pass in ensuring any kind of workplace safety amidst the largest pandemic in a century. It's clear that our government serves the rich, and as such are not willing to take any actions that would betray the interests of the bourgeoisie. Many of our societal problems surrounding poverty are persistent for this very reason. A third point made in the Communist Manifesto is that conservative socialism is inferior to communism because conservative socialism largely maintains the unequal relationship between worker and owner. Now, this really isn't a main point of the Communist Manifesto, but I found it interesting because the author's descriptions of conservative socialism seem to match many of the policies advocated by leftists today. Marx and Engels have this to say about conservative socialism. The socialistic bourgeois want all the advantage of the modern social conditions without the struggles and dangers necessarily resulting therefrom. They wish for a bourgeoisie without a proletariat. The bourgeoisie naturally conceives the world in which it is supreme to be the best, and bourgeois socialism develops this comfortable conception into various more or less complete systems. In other words, members of a socialist bourgeoisie wish to uplift the proletariat to their own standards with the underlying assumption that if the working class were to share some of the characteristics of the bourgeoisie, they would be in a much better condition. This kind of idealism can be found in many modern-day leftist movements. For example, Senator Bernie Sanders staked his presidential campaign on proletariat access to universal healthcare and free higher education, which would give the working class an equitable chance to elevate themselves. Further on the left, candidates like Howie Hawkins of the Green Party advocate for public ownership of industry, affordable housing for all, and worker cooperatives. If Marx were alive today, he'd likely critique such movements for working within the confines of the exploitative relationship between worker and owner, rather than advocating for a complete proletariat revolution. I don't know if I agree with Marx on this point, however. It's well documented that the social programs advocated for by Sanders or Hawkins have improved the conditions of the working class in other nations, regardless if they maintain an unequal power structure or not. After decades of suppression by McCarthyism and the CIA, the American left is barely beginning to come back into the spotlight, and has yet to even win over much of the working class. I'd take what I could get at this point, and leave the full revolution for later, if we even get there. So, to conclude, the Communist Manifesto accurately depicts many of the societal problems faced under modern capitalism, an impressive feat given that this was written 172 years ago.